Hello everyone, today I want to talk about painting with the Lasso Tool because it's something that I've seen a lot of people very interested in and surprised when I tell them I've used the Lasso Tool for something, and it can definitely be a little bit intimidating and hard to know how to go about using it because it is a very different process from drawing with line, and that's actually one of the big reasons I really like to utilize this style sometimes, because it forces me to think through what I'm drawing differently, and that can be really useful and good for spurring on creativity if you're stuck. It's also just a really great way to go about drawing in general because you can get these really great contrasts between these hard lines and textures and painterly things. It makes me think a lot of Eric Carle, the illustrator who did The Very Hungry Caterpillar, his style. And so it's definitely something I encourage playing around with if you're drawn to that either paper cut type styles or that very hard line but textured. It's just a cool way to work. So today I'm going to show you how I go about using it, the kinds of brushes that I choose and why. And then I'm going to go through a demo of this cat here that's on the right and do a voiceover where I talk about why I make the decisions I make. And hopefully that makes it a little less scary to go into doing something new if you are unfamiliar with painting with the Lasso Tool. And if you are familiar with painting with the Lasso Tool, hopefully the way I do it is a little bit different than the way you do it and you can learn something new. So painting with the Lasso Tool just involves drawing a shape with the Lasso Tool and painting inside of it with your brush. When looking for a brush to use, I basically look for two things. The first is that you want something that can get pretty big, and the second is that you want something textured that texture or the opacity can be manipulated by how hard or light you press. So for example, this brush that I'm using here is Helby Glaze, which was made by 2His and is available for free on the Procreate resource forums. And below that are 5 other Procreate brushes that I find really useful for this process. I'm going to take a moment to go over these brushes, so if you don't use Procreate, feel free to skip to the timestamp included in the description. So first up is the Gouache Thin Scratchy from Max Ulichny's Gouache Pack, and I really like this one because you can get a lot of fun textures, but it's still pretty subtle, and this is actually the one that I use in the demo, so keep an eye out for that. And then next is the Blocky Bold from the Max Pex Retro Pack, and this one was actually made for this purpose, to be able to use with the Lasso Tool. So it's got a really impressive range of texture to very opaque depending on how light you press, and you can get different effects based on how large or small your brush is. So it's really neat. And the final Max Pex brush is the Gouache Flow Rough, and this one is even more subtle than the Thin Scratchy, and it's also more opaque, so you can get some kind of interesting things. It does blend a tiny bit, and it's just kind of a nice brush to play with. Now for the brushes that are available with Procreate as it is, the default brushes are the 2B Compressed. This one's really nice because you get a good range of texture, you get a good range of light to dark depending on how hard you press. It's just a solid choice for this process. You can find this brush under the charcoal section in your default brushes. And finally is the Oil Pastel brush. This one blends just a tiny bit more than the others, and it's also got a pretty good texture. I'm not a huge fan of the pastel canvasy look, so I don't use this one very much, but it is a solid pick for this process. You can find this brush under the sketching section of the default brushes. So to start off with, I have this reference, which is a photo of a sculpture that I did, and I am blocking in the most basic shapes of the background and the main color of the fur. And then I go in and I start blocking out shapes for the shadow areas. And so really this process is shortcutting from sketch directly into shape, and you're focusing on pushing and pulling shapes. So as you can see, I've added the highlight areas here, and a lot of the rest of this painting is just pushing and pulling those highlight and shadow shapes until it looks right to me. I find this to be super useful because when I'm drawing with line, it's really easy to get caught up in using that line and relying on that. I don't know about you, but you know, when you start out drawing as a kid, you're drawing with lines, with crayons. You're not usually thinking so much about shapes, you're thinking more in outlines. And there's definitely a time and place for outlines, but it really helps to pull me back and focus on the shapes more than just the lines when I use the lasso tool to paint instead of using a brush, even though you can get a lot of this approach with whatever medium you want, but it's just sort of baked into using the lasso tool. So I've started using some markings that aren't on my reference, just because I don't want it to just be a painting of a cat sculpture. I want it to look like a cat. It still ends up being a pretty sculptural approach, but that's why I started to add color and markings and stuff that aren't on my reference. Now I'm not really restricting myself to only using the lasso tool, so here I wanted some texture and I wanted it to fade out. I put it on a multiply layer, and then I used the lasso tool to cut out anything that I wanted to cut out. For the shadow, because we're working with these very hard edges from the lasso tool, I am layering all sorts of different sizes of this shadow to kind of give it this blurry effect. So if you were to blur your eyes at the final product, the shadow appears much more blurry than the rest of it, and so that's what I was going for here. And the way I'm doing that is by painting my shadow on another layer and then adjusting the opacity and then doing that over and over again. It's a very stylized approach to shadows, but it works really well. And once again, I'm going in and I'm freehanding in some texture and then using the lasso tool and clipping masks to cut it out or conform it to the shape below. And once I've gotten pretty solid basic lights and darks, I can start going in and adding in little details so that it looks a little bit more like fur. But I'm going back and forth still a lot. I'm noticing if there's dark that I think needs to be darker, or light that needs to be lighter, or light that needs to be toned down, and I'm making all of those little tiny adjustments as I go. Something you'll see me do a lot when I work is make something on a new layer and then adjust the opacity or try out different layer modes and then merge it down. I like working on one layer because I just get kind of overwhelmed if there's a lot of layers, and I also find that it can kind of decrease how spontaneous I work because I'm worried about keeping things in different places. Now, obviously this is not the best method for some things. Like if I'm working with a client and they need to be able to move things around, then I'll work on a separate layer. But for the most part, I tend to keep things on one layer and play around. So here I decided that I wanted to increase the lighting effect. And something that can be really interesting about my process is that when I make adjustments like these, sometimes the color and the value differences that happen are creating different effects, and it can be kind of hard to tell the difference between two. So I will copy my bottom layer and then merge the adjustment onto it and duplicate that, and turn one layer to color mode and one layer to luminosity so that I can adjust those two factors individually. This is a really useful method if you are using the overlay layer or add and you're finding that it's making something way too saturated. This is a really good way to skirt around that without erasing the value changes that are happening. So you can work with line with the lasso tool, but it is kind of a pain, so I try to keep it pretty minimal, but that's what I was doing here with the whiskers. And if I make one that's too thick, no problem, I can just cut it out with the lasso tool. And there you go, here's the finished product, and this was my lasso tool painting process. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to leave a comment and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.